Welcome everyone to this introduction to prioritized problems debates. I'm going to talk a little bit first about why we need to have a different form of debate, a different way of how we're doing things. So we have a political debates these days has really become kind of like professional wrestling. You've got different people with cool names that are out there. You got AOC versus the Donald, Bertie. And we're in these fights where things are kind of being portrayed as good versus evil. And so much of strategy is built around this idea of kind of like attacks and counterattacks. And what's happened is that we've gotten to this place where we really are not solving problems anymore. We're more so endlessly fighting over various different solutions that we want to do. Winning, the definition of winning really comes around to whether or not we actually get elected. And we've separated the ability to actually solve those problems from the ability to get elected, to the point more so that sometimes we entirely forget about the problem in the first place. So the problems end up to never get solved. Now, some of that comes from a decent place, and it comes from an origin in what we might call monarchy thinking versus democracy thinking. If you think back and sort of take yourself back into history to early origins of society, where we first started getting to things, the need for some of these things, you might be living in a kind of society or in a kind of place where we've got small groups of people that are living as part of a community. And then something happens. Maybe there's a drought, there's a famine, maybe there's attacking raiders and that are coming into this space. And if you do the wrong things, it can be really detrimental. So what we ended up looking for is people didn't want to make the wrong choices, the wrong decisions. So they were looking for people who knew what they were talking about or knew how to solve this problem. And we put those people in charge to do things. And we would get to this place where we were looking at we would set up these different dynamics, and we actually got to the point where our system of laws is based on a language thing. So law came from the word lay. It means the tongue, is the original definition of the word, the tongue of the king. If you ran into a situation, so what I was saying was that if we had these folks that knew how to solve complex problems, but what happens if you have two people that know how to solve this problem? You might start separating out into factions. And so we would have one faction that would be following one leader and another faction that would be following another leader. And as long as they didn't conflict on resources, everything was fine. But as soon as one needed a resource that the other group also needed, now we started ended up having battles. And so they would get into these fights as to which would do that. And so the way they chose to solve that was by having the two leaders fight each other. And whoever won the fight is probably going to be the best person to fight against the outside groups. And so that established this idea of coming together and basically battling behind solutions. Whoever has the better solution, whoever has the better approach, obviously is going to win on that. And so then that becomes the mono person to rule over, which was arch, and that became the origin of the word monarch. So when I say monarchy thinking in this kind of a context, what I'm talking about is this idea that we need to find the one right person who's going to rule over all of these things and then let them make that decision. It worked really well in those contexts for a while, but one of the things that we found over time is that that other person might have had some really great ideas, but they didn't win that battle. But if you tweak one little thing here or there, they might have actually had a better strategy than the first person. And that really was the origins to some of the democracy kind of thinking, where we were getting into understanding that there are components that can come out of either approach. And if we can find some way to merge them together, we can actually come up with a much more powerful way to do this. And some of the work that I do with organizations where we pull in these types of techniques, the ones that use democracy approaches over monarchy approaches in these definitions can sometimes be 5 to 10 times better in their output, a huge significant work. And so that's what we're looking to do here as well, is to find those ways to move forward, to do even more than we ever did before. And one of the things that we have to do is leave behind this idea of picking the winner and then letting the winner make all the decisions. And we do that inside of debate. So a lot of things that's happening in our classical forms of debate is that we have people pick up a side, pro and con, and we have them debate about, is this a good idea or that? And whoever wins the debate then gets to take over in our elections or in other things. But there is another way to do things, and that's the origins and the thought behind this process and this alternative way of having a discussion between things. So let's come around and take a look at some of these things. And so you can see in the slide that I have up here on the screen right now, our goal here is to solve problems. And that's the core difference of this. So we're not debating between the solutions that we are trying to put forward. We're debating between what problems are the problems that are more important to solve. Because often we don't disagree on the problems. I've been in several situations, and maybe you have too, where we all agree on what the problems are, but we disagree on how to solve them. Or we start working on the solution to a problem, and we maybe solve one problem, and then we start working on a solution to the second problem, but that solution undoes a bunch of the work that happened on the first stage of what we were doing. We can also create brand new problems when we start implementing solutions on previous ones. And not everybody wants to work on the same solutions at the same time, nor even implement the same solutions. There may be multiple ways forward that could equally solve this problem just as well as another. And if we get into this spot where we're basically forcing everybody to apply the same solution, these become a lot of the origins of the problems that we have. So what the prioritized problem debate does is it first rule out of the gate is we just are going to take solutions off the table. So we're just going to talk about problems. We're going to put the problems in order. And then after we prioritize and debate those problems, we'll come back and look at how to solve as many of those problems as we possibly can. This leads us into a difficult position here, which is that identifying what makes a good problem can often be a really hard thing. We spent so much time talking about solutions, sometimes we've forgotten what the original problem was. And so we're going to spend a little time up front under this banner of the Constitution that we've been talking about to kind of practice the difference between identifying what is a good problem versus what is a solution, so we can start to see a little bit of a difference. So I'm going to ask some of these questions as we come back through the different portions of the Constitution in the next couple slides. And we're going to ask some questions like, what makes life difficult? What is missing from here? How is this being, what is standing in the way of us solving this problem or implementing these solutions? And this is going to give us some sense of, is what we're talking about a problem, or is what we're talking about a solution? And you'll kind of see what I mean as we get into it. This is better witnessed in action and less so in conversation. All right, so I'm going to click through on some slides, but I'm going to hand it over to Bill. So Bill, if you're good to go, why don't you walk us through a couple of the initial sections of the Constitution as you were doing research on this, and give us a couple ideas of some things right now that may be experiencing some problems in our country that are part of the Constitution.
Great, thanks, Pete. So just a summary up front, the powers of each branch of the government are defined in the section that defines them. And if we look at Article 1, that defines the power of Congress in 875 words. And Article 2 defines the power of the executive branch, the president, but only in 322 words. So a lot less than the powers of Congress. And on a number of those powers, they are with the advice and consent of the Senate. So limiting factors as part of that. Article 3 defines the powers of the Supreme Court in 304 words. So a little less than the president. And even there's 3 places that call out Congress having powers. So in contract law, if there's dispute in a contract between 2 different clauses, whichever one comes first has precedence and rules over. So if you look at both volume and you look at precedence, the founding fathers didn't want one person making the rules and defining everything. They wanted a large group coming from all over the country, every state representative running the country, making the rules and deciding what we wanted to do. So that's what they gave us, and the separation of powers has been a great strength for us, and now we're struggling with it. So next slide. So if we look at powers of Congress to begin with, we'll start with to regulate commerce with foreign nations, tariffs, and we certainly hear a lot about that today. So why is the president defining all sorts of tariffs and doing all sorts of things associated with that? Well, when the Constitution was written, tariffs were the fundamental revenue source of the federal government, and were that way well through the Civil War until finally we passed an income tax. And today, tariffs are an insignificant part of our revenue stream. Income tax is the primary. So in 1934, Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act and said that foreign policy and trade agreements should be the president. So they delegated this responsibility, the Constitution they gave him, to the president. And then in the Trade Act of 1978, they specifically said he can change tariffs without their approval, and gave him that. So this is something that was not changed with an amendment to the Constitution, but rather with Congress delegating a power that was theirs to the president as part of that. But one has to ask themselves, if foreign policy is the thing driving why the president should do this, how does foreign policy affect being told Apple they have to make their phones here, or they're going to have a 25% tariff? Is that foreign policy? So number two that we look at is uniform rule of naturalization.
Actually, Bill, before we go on to that one,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, before we move on to the next one, so I want to do a little practice on problem identification.
Okay, sure.
Regulating commerce for foreign nations. So putting the hands of regulating commerce with foreign nations into the hands of Congress was a solution by the founders. And I'm kind of curious if anybody knows or anybody has any thoughts or guesses. You can use the raise hand feature down at the bottom of your window. What problem was were the founding fathers trying to solve by putting the hands of commerce by putting regulation of commerce in the hands of the Congress? Or alternatively, if you want to answer this question, I'm curious if anybody can think of or what you would see as the problem that Congress was trying to solve by then delegating this to the executive. Now, I think I heard one of the things in Bill's preamble for this, which is that the regulation of commerce, they were fighting against the power of the king to make all of these choices unilaterally. And so they very intentionally, the problem was when one person makes all of these choices and all of these decisions, they may not have the full perspective. And so therefore, I think the founding fathers made these choices to give this to Congress, to give this power to Congress as a result of trying to get around basically the rule of kings.
I agree with that.
Okay. So let me ask you, Bill. So what do you think is the reason? What problem do you think is being solved with Congress giving power to the executive branch to negotiate these things? What problem were they trying to solve when they did the delegation?
That they did not want to do foreign policy. They wanted the president to do foreign policy, and tariffs were now really an element of foreign policy, not a significant element of revenue generation.
Okay. All right. Why don't you go ahead and into rule of naturalization now?
Okay. So here we deal with who is a citizen, how one becomes a citizen, and certainly an amendment to the Constitution added in a specific right of naturalization of anyone born in the United States automatically is a citizen. So Congress has the power to make these rules. The president can't say that we're ending that. The president can't say you're not a citizen anymore. That is a power of Congress, and they make the rules.
Any thoughts on the problems that the founding fathers were trying to solve when it came to the rule of naturalization? I can say from my experience, I've been reading through, we got a book club coming up through Maryland Forward. It's called the Minotaur Book Club. You can find it in our events section coming up. And the book we're covering in the first round is The Forgotten Founders. Is about the relationship between the early American settlers and the Native Americans, and how a lot of the Constitution of the Iroquois was actually an influence in the establishment of the Constitution of the United States. And one of the things they talk about in there was that the process of actually dealing with Indian tribes differed from state to state to state in the early Union. And so negotiating as an Indian tribe with two neighboring states had two completely different rules on interactions and how things go. And I imagine a very similar thing was happening between that, as far as naturalization, who becomes a citizen. One state might admit you to become a citizen and one might not. And so it could be confusing. You could go over a border and become a citizen and then not become a citizen based upon the rules that were there. And it would make it very hard to kind of establish who was and was not a citizen as you traveled through the entire United States. Go ahead and finish off this here.
Okay.
Bill, and let's talk about the other ones that you highlighted here, and then I'm going to come back and ask a general question from the folks here. As far as my question, as Bill finishes off this section, is going to be, what are some of the problems that are currently being caused in any of the categories that are highlighted here in yellow? So what are certain things that you're seeing that's happening right now in the United States that are caused by problems either in enforcing the Constitution or in things that are not being enforced or being obstructed in the Constitution? But go ahead and Bill, and go ahead and finish off this section here.
So on the next one, Congress makes the rules for regulation of the armed forces and suppressing insurrections and repelling invasions. Who defines what is an invasion? So the president says we're being invaded by Venezuelans in a gang. Is that an invasion? And we have the judicial branch, a number of judges saying that's not an invasion, but the executive branch says it is. How do we resolve that? Well, Congress makes the rules. So, should they be the ones that step forward? And certainly one of the questions I think we can look at and ask is our situation today, is Congress abrogating many of the responsibilities that the founding fathers gave them to give us that broad-based direction? And are they willing to have an individual make decisions that the founding fathers didn't want one person making? And the next page, I think we've got another interesting one. So, exercise legislation over erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. The executive branch does not own the buildings that they occupy. Congress does. And they can't shut down. They can't decide they don't want the FBI moved to Greenbelt. Congress decided they were there. Clearly, this law is given, the responsibility and power is given to Congress for the erection of needful buildings. So here we have, again, a dispute between what the Constitution gives to Congress and what the executive branch wants to do as part of that. And then the second one, habeas corpus is getting a lot of attention, okay? And that's something that has been fundamental, that your due process. We're going to deport you because you're an illegal alien. Well, if you haven't had due process to prove you're a legal alien, then how do you know that? How does somebody just get deported because somebody said they're an illegal alien? So that's where the due process comes in as part of that. But the Constitution says, in case of rebellion or invasion, then it could be suspended. Again, are we facing an invasion? Who defines that? And we got one more in the next one, I think. So this one's very timely. No person holding any office, profit, or trust shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present, any emolument, office, title from any king. So, you know, a gift of a 747 from Qatar, you know, is from another foreign agency. So, you know, our Secretary of Defense has stood up publicly and said, this has been accepted by the Department of Defense, not the President, in compliance with all law. Well, not this one, because Congress has not approved it. They haven't had any hearings. They haven't had a vote. So we have a plane here, and we have people working on it and modifying it that we weren't allowed to accept. And then just the last one down at the bottom, section 4, back up a second to it. The time, places, and manners of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature. So the president can't say you have to be you have to prove your citizenship to vote. Every state gets to make that decision. Except Congress may at any time by law make or alter those regulations, and they can override the states, but they have to do that as an act of Congress, and that hasn't happened yet.
So one of the things that I wanted to sort of point out here is that, as with everything else here in the law, in the lay, these are primarily solutions. And so we can lose some sight as to what problems that we're trying to solve, to the point that some people don't believe that we should even enforce these laws anymore. So what are some problems that we are having in our political sphere right now that we think are being caused by, or are being caused by not enforcing these provisions? Becca, I see a hand up.
I think Bill did a good job at showing some examples. But I think Garcia being illegally deported and not being brought back, that's a clear constitutional violation. President Trump believes that Maryland is 3 hours away from DC and shouldn't be the headquarters for the new FBI. Bill kind of touched on that one. And that with the location, and I think I'm nervous about President Trump accepting the plane from the prince of wherever it came from, but that's a security breach. That's serious, and he's acting like it's like nothing. And so there's a lot of validity in going over this information about what we're seeing being played out and how I'm calling on the Congress. I'm waiting for Congress to continue to have these hearings and enforce what they're supposed to do. And when Trump became president, I was relieved that our Constitution was devised the way it was, because I feel like it was made for the times that we're in right now. Because Trump doesn't have the power to do half the stuff that he's doing, and it's just, sorry, this is a hot topic for me.
Yep.
And it angers me. So
you're not the only one there. All right. So getting this, so let's expand a little bit. You had two good ones in there. So what is the problem of deporting before we have executed the right of habeas corpus?
There wasn't he didn't have due process. There was no trial, no anything. And that went against his constitutional right to have a trial.
Yep. All very true. So what problem did that create?
Families are torn apart and freedoms are taken away. I mean, he is probably not in the best, he's not in a good environment for himself. And he's a father. He works in Maryland. So that's one employee not having taxes and all that stuff. Like, he's not working right now. He's not able to provide for his family, and his family could become homeless.
Yeah. I'm going to put it in this kind of way, so that basically saying without habeas corpus, we take away freedoms without a legal basis. Probably some better ways to say that.
Yes, sorry.
Or sort of figuring this out together.
I think it's stronger than that.
Yeah.
Because any of us could be just deported.
Yeah, I'm afraid of being deported, and I'm born and raised. I'm not from a family of immigrants, but like, this could happen to anyone. Like, they could do this to anyone without any cause, and just say, oh, we'll send them to so and so because they whatever. Like,
Yeah.
They said something nasty about it.
Anyone could suffer the consequences of punishment, regardless of whether or not they are guilty. Okay.
And Pete, going to your question of what was the problem that looking to solve, and how has that changed now? I believe the problem they were looking to solve was an individual making arbitrary decisions with no recourse and causing great difficulty. They didn't want that. They wanted to have consensus. They wanted to have better thought going into decisions. But that better thought takes time, and we now have Congress that can't agree on anything. So it's highly inefficient. So is inefficiency worth the price of not being subject to an individual's capricious decisions?
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to try something here for this portion. Let's talk just about the habeas corpus. So let's talk about how we would actually have a discussion like this with somebody else. So there are a bunch of people who think that it was a good idea to just round people up and send them back. Why is that? What problem did they see being solved by ignoring habeas corpus? It's maybe a difficult conversation for some people. Quignardo, what you got? And you're on mute if you're talking.
Can you hear me?
Gotcha.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. So I'm retired Army, and I travel around a lot between Florida, and I just got back yesterday from Houston for about a week and a half. And prior to the election, during the campaigning period, I talked with a lot of people in communities of the Latino community down in Florida, mostly Orlando and other areas. And now talking with the community there, and one of the things that I noticed is that people were, one, fearful of not having jobs for their children. And I'm not talking about just the white community as we look at, like from West Virginia or other areas that were Trump staunch supporters, but I'm talking about communities of the people, their families, and other places and spaces they're coming from. So one of the problems was, we're looking at jobs for our children too. We're looking at schools and safety. This is what I was hearing from other communities, because I wanted to do a listening tour while talking to people versus projecting my viewpoint to it. So the language actually scared them. That's one. And I think the second thing that I heard a lot, especially in Texas, was people using American resources such as Medicare and other healthcare, other services that belong to Americans. and they didn't want that to be provided to someone that wasn't a citizen. So those were two of the biggest, I would probably say the biggest issues and concerns that people had who were supporting that. I talked with a lot of Venezuelans who came here as a result of the recent troubles of Venezuela, who came here legally they have legal status. And when I go back to Orlando in about in a few weeks, I'm gonna go back, and one of the questions I'm gonna ask is, are you in jeopardy now? Because now the ruling for Venezuela is that they're not necessarily protected from the same laws that they thought they was protecting themselves from by deporting people. So I think we have to look at why the masses of people supported it. And I think those were two of the largest issues that I heard.
All right. So I'm going to do a little comparison. Thank you so much, Leonardo. I think that gives a good contrast here. So we talk about this issue with habeas corpus, and Congress, or the Constitution, says very clearly, precedent, most important problem to solve is this idea that anyone could suffer the consequences of punishment regardless of whether or not they're guilty. And so as a result of respecting habeas corpus, we put people through the process of legal review, even though it means that for a while, it may mean that there are not enough jobs for people. And even if that means that for a while that there are non-citizens who may be using services that they have not paid for or that are paid for by citizens. So this is established in the Constitution. But what we're saying is that for the people in Texas, they see it in this direction. And actually, I might even say that that one's not even on the table. So they're saying that the most important problem to me is that our services are being used up by citizens or non-citizens, and so that there is less available for the citizens who paid for them. Therefore, it is okay for us to take people and get them out of the country if they seem to be illegal, or if we do enough figuring on that. And that's against the Constitution. So I'm not advocating for this, just making a list of the way that they're thinking about that. Now, the other thing that you're saying about Florida is it's a little bit more like this, where they're saying that the lack of jobs is so great and it's causing such a hardship for citizens that they're not so concerned about the consequences, or they're not even thinking about guilty or innocence. Just get those people out of the country. People who are taking the jobs, get them out of the country. So this helps us to understand how other people are thinking, to help us to understand the conversation. And so one of the big differences in how we're approaching this and how we're recommending talking to people is to spend this time up front to ask them questions, just like Quignardo did. I want to hear from you as to what are the big issues that you think that you want to solve. He identified a couple of those things, but then we want to put them in order and actually have that conversation with these people and say, okay, great. So these are problems. Not having a job is a big problem, and it's causing huge hardship for people. Not to mention not being able to have services and having money and debts and all these other things is also a big problem. But the solutions to these are causing problems down here. So the question to all those people in Florida or Texas are, which do you think is a bigger problem? So if you got deported to another country without a trial and were just stuck there and had no way to get back and no recourse, is that worth making sure there's enough jobs for people? And ask them that question. Which is the higher problem for you? And probably for themselves, they would say that, yeah, I don't want to be deported if I'm not guilty. If I've done something, I got no problem with it, but if I'm not. But getting them to compare two problems together instead of just looking at one problem and solving it regardless of the consequences is the difference in thinking that we're trying to get to. And this is the way we want to change debate, that we never ever talk about a single problem and what's the best solution to a single problem, but that we actually have a clear conversation with other people based upon what is the higher problem? What is the problem that we should not make worse when solving another problem that arises? And the Constitution says this, but it'd be curious to see from these people who advocate, deporting people because there's not enough jobs. If this was applied to them, would they be happy? All right, we're down to just about 8 o'clock here. So can I do a quick thing? So Quinyara, if you don't mind holding on for just a minute. Bill, was there any wrap up that you wanted to do just within the 8 o'clock? And then maybe we can turn off the recording. We can have an open Q&A session.
Sorry, no additional wrap up. So just go ahead.
Okay. Unless Quinyarda, did you want to say something on the record?
Are you able to hear me now? I just took it off from me.
Yes.
Oh, excellent. But yes, on the record, I would love to say that after listening, you summed it up excellently on both sides, from Texas and also from Florida perspective. One of the things that I did a lot was educated people on the laws of the U.S., because a lot of people have perspective on the laws of the U.S. based on their 30, 40, 50 years of experience in the country that they're coming from, and they're applying their perspective of the laws into how we should interpret it. So I think the interpretation of our U.S. laws, as how you started off talking about the articles and the different sections of the articles of the Constitution, I think that is what's needed all across the U.S. so people can understand what is legal, what is given to the powers of the president, and what is retained by the powers of Congress. If we can have that conversation and people can understand that part better, the conversation can go a lot better.
Totally agree. And I think one of the things I'm having in conversations with people, if we take this one as an example, is that with the habeas corpus, people don't understand or necessarily see this, or they talk about it and they're like, oh yeah, of course. Like, I would never want to be sent anywhere or be immediately thrown into jail without there first being some kind of a trial. And then you mentioned what's happening with the people being deported, and then they don't make a connection, or they don't see what is the problem that's happening. I've had this conversation. I've seen this conversation happen in media where we talk about the deportation and people are on there and saying, well, the only reason they arrested him is because they were guilty in the first place, right? And they don't even hear the other part of the story, which is that this person had already gone through the legal system. Talking about this guy from Maryland, Garcia, had already gone through the legal system, had already had this stuff debated, had already had this stuff thrown out by a judge, had already been determined as non-threat. And none of those conversations were had when the person was picked up off of the street and then sent down to El Salvador. And so a lot of people don't realize that never happened. But starting from a conversation about all of the problems then allows us to have a more detailed discussion about the nuances of how one solution causes another problem. What you got, Bill?
So as we do this, it's interesting on social media when folks are making statements of this is so unconstitutional, and it's clear they've never read the Constitution. So I just put into chat a link to 8 pages, the preamble and Articles 1, 2, and 3. And what we've done, I've highlighted a few ones. We've got some others if we want to get to those as well. But if you haven't recently read, it's all of 8 pages. Download it, and it's really interesting what the Constitution says.
Yeah. So those would be the thoughts or challenges out there, and the things that we're tackling here is we're trying to understand the minds of the founders, since we don't always know what problems they were trying to solve. Some of them we know more about than others, but we want to know what those problems are. And we also want to do what Quinyardo is doing. So props to you, Quinyardo. Really appreciate the stories that you're sharing and the fact that you went down to Florida and Texas and had those conversations with people to better understand their points of view and where they're coming from, because that really is the first step towards connecting grounds. finding ways to connect with people and change minds and change the way people think.